I have been thinking a lot about the changing global landscape, and I am ready to share my thoughts. For nearly 50 years, I have studied the patterns that drive financial systems, the debt cycles, the currency dynamics, and the quiet institutional shifts that almost never make front page news until it is too late. I was watching closely when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971 and the world entered a new era of floating currencies backed by nothing but trust, and I understood exactly what that meant for the decades that would follow. I was also watching in 2008 when the mortgage market collapsed under the weight of paper promises that turned out to be worth far less than anyone had admitted, and I recognized that collapse not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of a pattern I had been tracking for years. When I speak today, I am not speaking from theory. I am speaking from nearly 5 decades of watching money behave the way it always does when it is stretched too far for too long. The crisis I want to discuss is not some distant possibility waiting on the horizon. It has been building quietly, like water working its way through concrete, and by the time most people feel it, the damage will already be done. The single most alarming number in the American financial landscape right now is this. The United States national debt is growing by approximately $1 trillion every 100 days. Not 1 trillion in a year. 1 trillion every 100 days. That pace means the debt is expanding faster than the economy is growing, faster than tax revenues can absorb, and faster than any realistic political solution can address. If you are between 40 and 60 years old, that number does not belong in a news broadcast. It belongs on your kitchen table, right next to your retirement account statement, because the two are connected in ways that most people have never been told. When you truly understand the link between a government's debt problem and the real value of your savings, something shifts inside you and you cannot unsee it. If you have not already hit that notification bell on this channel, now is the time to do exactly that. What I am going to walk you through in the next several minutes is not the kind of conversation that gets covered on mainstream financial news. And if you step away without pressing that button, you will almost certainly miss the follow-up to this video that goes even deeper into the specific positions that protect you. Think of it as leaving the last and most important chapter of a book unread, right at the moment the story starts to matter most. Most people understand inflation the way they understand a cold. It is uncomfortable for a while, it passes, and then life returns to normal. But what is happening right now at a structural level is a different kind of condition entirely. Let me give you a picture that makes this easier to hold in your mind. Imagine you own a receipt for a storage unit that contains something genuinely valuable. That receipt has a dollar amount printed on it. Now imagine that every year, quietly and without announcement, the government prints millions of new receipts and puts them into circulation. The storage unit has not changed. The thing inside is exactly what it was. But now there are more receipts chasing the same content, and each receipt represents a slightly smaller share of what is inside. That is what is happening right now to every dollar-denominated savings account, every bond, and every pension fund that holds paper promises rather than real assets. Your balance might read the same. The number on the screen might look stable, but the real claim that number holds over actual goods, actual land, actual energy, and actual services is quietly and steadily shrinking. What your financial advisor almost never explains is that the purchasing power of paper money is not protected by law. It is protected only by trust in the institution that issues it. And right now, that trust is being tested in ways I have not witnessed since the late 1970s. The truly unsettling part is that most people will not realize their wealth has been hollowed out until they actually try to spend it in retirement. I want to tell you about a man I know named Richard. Richard is 58 years old, a retired civil engineer from Columbus, Ohio, the kind of man who built his career on precision, on measurements that had to be exactly right, on blueprints where a single wrong number could cause something to fall. He was not someone who spent time worrying about monetary theory or long-term debt cycles. He had a solid pension, a well-diversified stock and bond portfolio, and a savings account he had been building patiently for over 30 years. When I first raised these concerns with him about 2 years ago, he listened politely and told me that he had been hearing end-of-dollar predictions for decades and that the financial system had always found a way through. He trusted his financial planner. He trusted the numbers he could see on his quarterly statements. Then Richard did something that only a man trained in engineering would think to do. He went back through 15 years of his own account statements and, using publicly available government inflation data, calculated what his total portfolio had returned in real terms, meaning after inflation had been stripped away. What he found was that his fixed income holdings, the bonds that were supposed to be the safe and boring foundation of his retirement, had delivered a real return of less than 1% per year over the past decade. After inflation, the supposed bedrock of his future had barely moved an inch. But that was not the number that finally changed his mind. The number that changed his mind was the 18% real decline in his bond portfolio's purchasing power during the 3 most recent years when inflation ran consistently above 5%. He built a spreadsheet at his kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon and called me that same evening. He did not sound alarmed. He sounded like an engineer who had just found a serious structural fault in a building that was already fully occupied. Within 6 weeks, Richard had moved 30% of his retirement savings out of long-duration bonds and into a combination of gold-backed assets, commodity-linked equities, and income-producing hard asset real estate positions. He did not do this because someone scared him into it. He did it because the numbers made the case on their own, without any emotional pressure, without any salesmanship. And when a man who has spent his life trusting only what he can measure and verify changes his mind at 58 about the foundation of his financial future, the reason is always worth understanding. Before I get into the data, let me ask you something worth sitting with for a quiet moment. Have you ever actually calculated what your savings would be worth in 10 years if the dollar loses 30% of its purchasing power during that window? Not the number in your account, but the real buying power of that number in the world you will be living in. If that calculation has never appeared on your kitchen table, that gap in your planning is itself a piece of information you needed today. Now, let me give you the specific data that Richard and I both looked at. The math does not lie. And once you see these 4 numbers side by side, you will understand why this is not a moment to remain comfortable in familiar positions. The first number is 43%. That is the reduction in the purchasing power of $1 since the year 2000. If you had $100,000 sitting in a savings account at the turn of this century and never touched it, that money today buys the equivalent of roughly $57,000 worth of goods. The balance on paper looks the same. The real buying power has been cut nearly in half over a single generation. The second number is 93 million. That is approximately how many Americans are currently between the ages of 40 and 65. The exact window of life where you are either building your peak wealth or beginning to draw it down. This is the group with the most accumulated savings and the least time to recover from a major disruption. These are teachers and nurses and small business owners and mechanics who have spent 20 or 30 years building something they believe will carry them safely through the rest of their lives. The third number is 117%. That is the current U.S. debt to GDP ratio. GDP, or gross domestic product, is the total value of everything the country produces in a single year. When a nation owes more than its entire yearly output, the mathematical options for resolving that burden all carry painful consequences for savers. Growth can help, but not quickly enough. Significant spending cuts are politically near impossible. Tax increases punish workers. The remaining path, allowing inflation to quietly erode the real value of the debt, is the one that directly punishes every person who saved their money in paper form. The fourth number is zero. That is the number of times in modern recorded history that a major economy successfully printed its way out of a significant debt spiral without causing meaningful damage to the real savings of its middle class. Not once in the modern era has it ended without cost to those who saved in paper. I have seen this before in other countries and other eras, and the sequence of events follows the same recognizable arc every time. It starts quietly. It then becomes impossible to dismiss. And by the time it becomes impossible to dismiss, the best positions have already been taken by those who moved earlier. Let me ask you something directly before we go further, and I want this question to sit with you rather than slide past. If you discovered tonight that the rules governing your retirement account could be changed by an institution you do not control in ways that affect your access to your own money, would you feel confident that you had already read everything in your account agreement that covers that possibility? If the answer is anything other than yes, you are carrying a risk you may not have chosen consciously. Keep that question in mind as you hear what comes next. Now, I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You are thinking that warnings like this have been issued for 4 decades, that people have been predicting dollar collapse and debt implosion since the Reagan era, and that the system has absorbed every single one of those predicted crises and kept moving. You are not wrong about that history. I am not going to argue against a record that is plainly visible. The system has repeatedly survived shocks that seemed fatal. But here is what that argument consistently misses. Survival is not the same as stability, and each survival has come at a cost. A building can survive a flood without collapsing, but if the foundation has been quietly soaking in water for years, the next flood does not need to be larger to cause the collapse. Each time the financial system survived a major crisis since 1987, it did so by adding more debt, lowering interest rates further, and expanding the money supply more aggressively. Each of those tools worked because they had room to operate. The problem we face now is that interest rates were raised sharply to fight inflation, and the debt load at those higher rates is now consuming a historically large share of federal government revenue before a single program is funded or a single road is repaired. The skeptics who say the system always finds a way are using a pattern from a past where the emergency tools were still fully loaded. The tools are not fully loaded in the same way anymore. A car that has run on fumes for 20 miles is not evidence that fumes are a sound long-term fuel strategy. The people who actually moved the largest sums of money on Earth have already begun responding to exactly what I am describing. Global central bank gold purchases exceeded 1,000 tons in a single reporting year, according to data published by the World Gold Council. That represents the highest level of sovereign gold acquisition recorded since the Bretton Woods system collapsed and nations began managing their own currency reserves independently. This is not symbolic buying. These are sovereign governments with the most sophisticated economists and risk models on the planet, making sustained multi-billion-dollar decisions to move out of dollar-denominated paper and into physical gold. Poland's central bank publicly stated that it was accelerating its gold accumulation program specifically as a hedge against geopolitical risk and currency instability. China's central bank added to its gold reserves for over a dozen consecutive months without a single interruption. When institutions of that scale, managing assets that dwarf the savings of every individual reading this, make a coordinated and sustained move of that kind, the rest of the market eventually follows. That sentence is not an opinion. It is a pattern I have watched repeat itself across several decades. What makes this moment structurally different from previous periods of financial stress is not just the debt level or the money supply growth. It is the convergence of multiple massive geopolitical forces all moving in the same direction at the same time. China has been methodically reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds for years, while simultaneously building domestic gold reserves to levels not seen in its modern financial history. This is not a short-term reaction to any single political event. It is a deliberate, long-term preparation for a world in which the dollar plays a diminished role in global trade settlement, and China has been moving toward that position with patience and strategic consistency. Russia's experience in 2022, when its dollar-denominated foreign reserves were frozen by Western governments, sent an unmistakable message to every other nation on Earth that held dollar assets as strategic wealth. The message was direct. Those assets can be confiscated by political decision in a matter of days, with no court process and no warning. That single event permanently changed the risk calculation for dozens of central banks and sovereign wealth funds. Countries from India to Brazil to Saudi Arabia began quietly reevaluating how much of their national wealth they were willing to store in a currency that could be turned into a weapon against them. U.S. government spending policy, rather than responding to this structural shift with meaningful fiscal restraint, has continued to produce deficits that require a constant stream of new buyers for Treasury debt. As foreign governments reduce their appetite for that debt, the burden shifts inward, which creates additional pressure on the currency. When you look at all of these forces together, the Chinese repositioning, the Russian demonstration of dollar asset risk, the emerging market diversification away from Treasury dependence, and the continued expansion of U.S. deficits, you are not looking at a collection of unrelated trends. You are looking at a convergence that has a historical logic to it, and convergences of this kind do not resolve without consequence. Here is a question I want you to genuinely sit with tonight after this video ends. Do you actually know what you own? Not the fund name, not the category label on your statement, but the specific physical or real asset that sits beneath the paper promise your account represents? And if that underlying asset is a promise made by an institution that operates under rules that can change, do you know what those rules currently say about your rights? If you are not certain about either of those answers, that uncertainty itself is something that deserves your attention before the rules change in ways you did not anticipate. Let me take you back to a moment that most people under 50 have never studied, but that reveals everything about how this pattern resolves. In the early 1920s, Germany was a prosperous, educated, industrialized nation with a sophisticated banking system and a middle class that had spent decades building genuine savings. After the First World War, the government faced enormous debt obligations and began managing them by printing money. In the early years, the effects were subtle enough to dismiss. Prices rose a little, life adjusted a little. Savings accounts still showed the same numbers. The paper looked intact. People trusted the system because the system had always been trustworthy. Then, between 1921 and 1923, the process accelerated beyond anything the people living through it believed was possible in a modern economy. By November of 1923, the exchange rate between the German mark and the US dollar had reached roughly 4 trillion to 1. People who had spent their entire working lives building careful savings in German marks found that those savings would not purchase a week of basic groceries. A retired school teacher who had put away the equivalent of a comfortable middle-class retirement over 30 years saw that wealth reduced to almost nothing in less than 24 months. The events moved faster than the human ability to process them and respond. The people who came through that period with their financial security intact shared exactly one characteristic. They held real assets, physical gold kept in their possession, agricultural land they could stand on, equity in businesses that produced actual physical things, ownership of buildings that generated rents paid in goods or currencies that held value, not paper claims on those things, the things themselves. The paper holders lost. The real asset holders survived, and some of them actually grew in relative wealth because they had something real to offer when others had only paper. I am not predicting that outcome for America. I am telling you clearly and calmly that this same underlying pattern, the quiet erosion of paper value, followed by a sudden and irreversible recognition of that erosion, is forming right now in front of us, and the time to respond to a pattern is always before it completes, not during the moment of completion. Let me walk you through the 3 ways this could unfold over the next 5 to 10 years, because the strongest financial position is one that holds up regardless of which path actually materializes. The first possibility is the mild outcome. In this scenario, policymakers manage to thread a difficult needle. Debt growth slows, inflation returns to a manageable level over several years, and the dollar loses purchasing power gradually and steadily rather than in a sudden break. Even in this best case, a retirement portfolio built entirely of paper assets, savings accounts, money market funds, and long-duration bonds will continue losing real value quietly every year. The person who has shifted meaningful exposure toward real assets and inflation-resistant positions will simply preserve more of what they spent decades building. The mild scenario is the friendliest possible path, and even in the friendly path, sitting entirely in paper is a losing position over time. The second possibility is the moderate outcome. In this scenario, inflation proves considerably more stubborn than the current market consensus expects. Interest rates remain elevated for a prolonged period, and the cost of servicing the national debt at those elevated rates consumes an unsustainable share of government revenue. At some point, a policy decision is made, either openly or through the passive mechanism of allowing inflation to run consistently above the rate that Treasury bonds are paying, that results in a meaningful and sustained decline in the dollar's real purchasing power over a 3 to 5 year window. People in their 40s and 50s who did not reposition find that the retirement number they had been counting on looks materially different than it did when they last reviewed their plan. People who hold real assets move through this period with their standard of living largely intact. The third possibility is the severe outcome. A sudden disruption, perhaps triggered by a failed Treasury bond auction, a sharp geopolitical escalation, or a rapid coordinated reduction in foreign central bank dollar holdings, causes a fast and disorderly repricing of dollar-denominated assets. This is the scenario most people instinctively refuse to consider because it feels too extreme. But recorded financial history does not grade on a curve of what feels plausible. When the trust underpinning a currency breaks, it tends to break with speed that surprises even those who predicted it. In this scenario, real assets are the only reliable store of value, and the gap in financial outcomes between people who held real things and people who held paper claims becomes the defining story of that generation. In all 3 possibilities, the position that performs best is the same one: meaningful, tangible, inflation-resistant ownership of real assets over paper promises. So here is what you actually do. Not eventually and not after. The next news cycle confirms what you already understand this week. First, build a complete and honest inventory of everything you currently own across every account you hold. For every single position, ask one question. If the dollar loses 30% of its purchasing power over the next 5 years, what specifically happens to the real value of this holding? Fixed income and savings accounts will be hurt. Commodity-linked assets and income-generating real property will likely hold their ground. Hard asset-backed positions will likely gain ground. You cannot make sound decisions about where you need to go until you are entirely honest about exactly where you currently stand. Second, begin directing new contributions and rebalancing decisions toward the hardest and most real forms of the assets that matter. Physical gold, held through a thoroughly researched custodian or in your own direct possession, is fundamentally different from a paper gold fund that holds electronic promises. Income-producing real property is fundamentally different from a paper real estate trust that can suspend redemptions when stress arrives. The distinction between owning the real thing and owning a paper derivative of the real thing is not a minor technicality. In a genuine stress event, that distinction often determines whether you keep what you built or discover it was never quite as solid as the statement said. Third, identify and watch one specific number as your ongoing signal for the months ahead. That number is the real interest rate, which is the stated yield on U.S. Treasury bonds minus the current rate of inflation. When the real rate is deeply negative and stays that way for an extended period, meaning inflation is running higher than what bonds are paying you to hold them, the system is actively transferring wealth from savers to debtors, and paper is losing the battle. Check that number once a month. You do not need hourly market data. You need that one number, read consistently, to stay oriented to the actual direction of the situation. Fourth, act with a sense of timing that matches the actual urgency of what the data is already showing. The window between when institutional money repositions and when the broad retail market catches up is historically narrow. Central banks have been accumulating gold at record levels for over 2 years. The longer the average saver waits for the mainstream financial press to validate what the data already clearly shows, the more of that window will have already passed. The people who waited during the 2008 credit crisis for absolute certainty before taking action made their moves at the worst possible entry points. You do not need certainty to act prudently. You need clear probability and a consistent direction. Both of those are present right now. Fifth, and this step is the one that will ultimately determine whether the first 4 steps deliver any real benefit. Prepare yourself emotionally and structurally for volatility ahead. There will be periods of apparent calm. There will be moments when the news cycle suggests the worst has passed and the old normal is returning. Your instinct in those moments will be to relax back into the comfort of familiar positions. The people who genuinely benefit from acting now are not the ones who make a single smart decision at the right time. They are the ones who make that decision, understand why they made it, and hold their position with calm and informed conviction when everything around them becomes noisy and uncertain. Build that conviction from knowledge now, before the noise arrives. Here is everything we covered today, and I want you to hear each of these points fully before you close this video. The U.S. national debt is growing faster than any political solution can realistically match. The dollar has already lost nearly half of its real purchasing power since the year 2000. Central banks around the world are buying gold at the highest rates recorded since the 1970s. China is systematically repositioning for a world in which the dollar holds reduced authority over global trade. Russia demonstrated permanently that dollar assets carry political risk that no legal protection can guarantee away. Emerging market nations are reducing their treasury exposure in quiet but sustained ways. Real interest rates are sending a warning that paper savers are losing ground. History shows this pattern with consistent and painful clarity. Paper holders lose. Real asset holders survive. You are between 40 and 60. You have built something real with your years of effort and discipline. You do not have the luxury of a long recovery window if this unfolds the way the data suggests it will. What you choose to do or not do in the next 12 months may carry more weight for your long-term financial security than anything you did in the previous 20 years combined. Attention paid today is free. Regret paid later is expensive in ways that no account balance can measure.